I grew up in a town of 123 people in the South, and I live in Los Angeles today. And so, one thing that I was very interested in is why is it that people that grew up where I grew up think that people that live in Los Angeles aren't real Americans? Why is it that people in Los Angeles don't think the people that I grew up with are intelligent, smart people that also have different viewpoints about the world based on their experience? I was very curious about that because I have lived both ends of my life across that spectrum.
There's a powerful feeling in our politics that we are living at the end of something.
People are very fearful.
Things appear to be shifting under our feet.
Today, every group in America feels threatened. When groups feel threatened, they retreat into tribalism, us versus them.
If my side loses, if the other side wins, that is the end of days. And that, to me, is playing with fire.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another one, CONVOS. Today, joining us is another very special guest, filmmaker, director, James Kicklighter, to talk about his new documentary, The American Question. Thank you for joining us and taking time out to talk with us.
Thanks for having me, Dario. I appreciate it.
Yeah, like I said, so we're going to be discussing, obviously, kind of a little bit of your career, what you do, your film, new documentary that just came out and everything. But before I get to that, like I like to get everybody like a little bit of background of yourself and like kind of like talk about how you got into film, like what kind of first brought you to this kind of career choice and like wanted to get into this field.
Yeah, when I was 16, I got wind of a documentary that a local college professor was making, and I convinced my mom that was a great idea for me to work on this film. Growing up in a town of 123 people in South Georgia, not many people worked in the film business. A lot of people were farmers, teachers, insurance salesmen, etc. And so that film exposed me to the world of filmmaking. I got to go to almost 18 states. We interviewed people like Dixie Carter from Designing Women, John Mellencamp, and all of these interesting people that were not otherwise accessible to me. And I learned a lot about how the business works. I learned how to pitch things to agents. I learned how to coordinate travel, how to produce things. And while that documentary was terrible and none of us actually knew technically what we were doing, it was a really informative experience. And through that experience, I kept making my own stuff. And over time, other people let me make stuff with their money. So that's how I kind of got started in film.
Okay, so like, you working on a film, finally, like that kind of got you the bug of like wanting to like do this yourself.
Exactly, because I loved storytelling and always, even as a kid, I loved to write, I loved to read. And so for me, storytelling in a visual medium in film became that avenue to, tell the stories that I found interesting.
So growing up, like what were some of your favorite films or like influences that like you kind of can point towards? Like that's what made me want to like actually become a director.
Yeah, I there are so many examples of that, but the film that I really love the most, that I still is my favorite film to this day, is Network, the 1976 film by Sidney Lumet. And the film as a teenager that really spoke to me was Almost Famous, which of course reminded me a lot of my own journey, not being a music journalist, but being a young kid that didn't know what he was doing, learning about himself on the road. That's always spoken to me because it's so personal. And that film, I see a lot of myself and William Miller. So that was something that I definitely admired as a kid.
Yeah, it's definitely classic, Almost Famous. Like I haven't seen that in a while. That's definitely one that I think inspired a lot of people to kind of want to do that because it was like kind of a coming of age story as well as like kind of chasing your dream or finding like your passion and love for life, especially like at a young age. I think that's what it did a really good job of like portraying.
Yeah, and it really shows you the kind of fake it till you make it thing, right? Because William Miller, of course, is a young kid who doesn't know what he's doing, but he's being thrust into this world that's much bigger than he is, that's much scarier and more shark-like, and he's learning how to navigate that through the people that he's with, some of which have their lives together, some of which do not. And so for me, that film really spoke to me and still does. It's still one of my favorite films.
Yeah, kind of think that's you mentioned. Kind of think about it. It is very much in parallel with I think with film and the film industry because like you look at it from the outside, you think everybody just knows what they're doing, they have it all together. But then like when you get into it, you're like, oh, we're all kind of just faking it a little bit and kind of figuring out as we go along, you know.
Well, every project, is its own journey. You don't know what you're making till you start making it. It doesn't matter if it's a scripted film, an ad, if it's a documentary, all of those different mediums in filmmaking start from nothing. And so you're really starting from scratch and trying to convince people that the vision you have is one that's credible and something that is going to work out in the end after all that money and time is spent. And so I think the older I've gotten and the more films I've made through my career, the more you learn that nobody knows anything. Yeah. It's really just about trying to do the best you can, and hopefully that's going to work out. And you just keep pushing and pushing and pushing, and that's the process of making a career.
So, like, were documentaries and that kind of genre and field of film always been like your main point of interest, or did you kind of come to it later on, or have you done other films, just more traditional films, or is documentary kind of your main lane?
I've been very fortunate in my career to do a wide variety of things. I've done everything from scripted films to advertising to documentaries. As of late, I've been doing more documentaries because it has been different topics that have just spoken to me more on a creative level. Mm-hmm. And also in Hollywood over the last 2 or 3 years between COVID and the strikes and such, it's been a little bit easier to make documentaries than it has been to do independent films. And so I've been doing that more lately. But as far as what speaks to me, it's really about what is the story, what is something that I want to spend years of my life making, because that's something that you don't always think about as a young filmmaker. When you commit to do a feature film, be it a documentary, a scripted film, whatever it is, television series, you are spending years of your life on that project. So it better be something you're passionate about, because you're going to have to be there for the long haul.
Yeah, especially with documentary filmmaking, because it can take years before it even comes to light or fruition or completion, sometimes even decades, depending on what topic you're kind of covering. So what are some of the more unique challenges that you find with documentary filmmaking as opposed to, more scripted type of work?
Well, scripted work, you're starting with a screenplay, right? You have something that's a roadmap for what you're going to do. And that doesn't mean that script is going to change. Of course, you might be evolving that through filming. You might be doing rewrites. You might be doing improvisations. There are lots of ways that material can change. But in a documentary, you're starting with a concept. You're kind of doing it in the inverse. You're saying, here's the idea that we're starting with, and how are we going to build that script out? And so the processes are very complementary, but also extremely opposite all at the same time. Yeah.
And I guess what are some your favorite parts of documentary filmmaking as opposed to script writing, and what are some of the parts that maybe you might not love the most about that particular style of shooting?
Sure. Well, with documentaries in particular, as I said, you start with a concept and then you're kind of building it out. And so sometimes the film that you think you start out making 99% of the time is not the thing you end up with at the end, because each interview is going to present something new that you may not have known before. You might get new information that totally spins the story in a different direction. And so in documentaries, you have to be a little more malleable about the kind of story you're telling while still holding true to the vision you started out with. And in a screenplay, of course, you're starting with the written word. And if it's not on the page, it's not going to be on the screen. It will not work if you do not have a good, effective script. And so really the processes and the complications between them are making sure when you're doing a scripted film that you've got it in the screenplay before you start shooting, because you cannot fix it in post. You cannot fix it while you're filming it. And in a documentary, it's being open enough to say and humble enough to say that this might be what I thought this was going to be at the beginning, but as I get new information, this is how the story might be evolving, and this is how we need to follow it.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a good point, especially considering, I guess, this new documentary, The American Question. I don't know exactly how long it took you to make, or what year you kind of started filming this.
We started it in 2016, and we filmed it on and off for 8 years. It's not the only thing I've done over the last 8 years. I also directed a short film called Angel of Anywhere, a feature film called The Sound of Identity. So I've done other things between as well. But this was like a little summer camp we kept coming back to, or I should say winter camp, because the entire film is set in winter, shooting over 8 years on and off with different individuals, experts, different cities. And so that process, of course, is very different, because you're shooting something over time to see how people and ideas and communities evolve when it comes to American polarization and decline of trust in society. And so that requires a very different process because you have to be very patient to see how that unfolds over time.
Yeah. And like I said, you started in 2016, so 8 years to now. A lot of things have happened in America. Like a lot has happened from COVID to elections to everything. So like from when you started to like where it is now, I'm sure there was like so many like twists and turns that nobody could have really foreseen, and just like not really known going into this is how it was going to be kind of be like as timely and like kind of resonant of what was going on as when you first probably started.
Yeah, well, when we first started, we thought it was going to be a 2-year project that turned into a 4-year project that turned into an 8-year project. And so it was really about convincing our investors that this is something that needs to play out over a longer period of time. This is something that we are going to pull off, but in order to show the trajectory of time change and what's happening in American culture, it's going to really require that scope. And certainly at the beginning, we knew that there were certain things that were happening that could unfold in different ways. But as I said earlier, the only thing that you can do is really let those things unfold and see what you're right about and see what you're wrong about. And then that's really the job of, I would say, the curious director, to make sure that the things you're following are genuine and not something you're imposing on it. It's something to say that this is actually how this is playing out.
I guess, and The American Question is the name of the documentary. Could you like maybe give like a quick kind of like synopsis for like maybe listeners that maybe not know about the documentary, what's about, like what is your topic, and kind of like what like brought you to this idea in the first place?
Yeah, so The American Question is a feature documentary that explores how America's trust in each other eroded over time. To say that why is it that people that live in blue states or red states or conservative cities or liberal cities, how is it that these people don't trust each other anymore, can't talk to each other anymore? How is it that family members can't have discussions with each other about things they disagree with, friends that fall off, people that get blocked on Facebook, things like that? To say, how did this happen over time? And not just over those 8 years, of course, but what were the conditions that led to that moment over a long period of time? And so what we did was we followed regular folks in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, in Erie, Pennsylvania, and Detroit, Michigan, representing a small suburban and urban town, to see how their feelings about various hot button topics like economics, immigration, polarization, social decline would evolve over time, and to see how they would change and how that influences the way we think about things today. And so what we did was we coupled all those people with experts across the philosophical spectrum, people in history, people in politics, people in sociology, to really explain how these things occurred over a long period of time and give you as a viewer actionable steps to do something about it now.
Was there like a moment in your like personal life that like made you kind of recognize this as something that's like particularly happening, and that made you want to cover this, not necessarily from personal perspective, but like something that happened around your personal purview in your life that you're like, this is something that's happening, it's something I should cover and that I'm interested in covering?
Yeah, there are two things I would say. First of all, I grew up in a town of 123 people in the South, and I live in Los Angeles today. And so one thing that I was very interested in is, why is it that people that grew up where I grew up think that people that live in Los Angeles aren't real Americans? Why is it that people in Los Angeles don't think the people that I grew up with are intelligent, smart people that also have different viewpoints about the world based on their experience? I was very curious about that because I have lived both ends of my life across that spectrum. And there are lots of really smart people where I grew up. There are lots of smart people where I live now. So why can't they trust each other? That was one thing. And then the second, of course, was I worked on Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2016. I was directing ads for her. I was in charge of the state of Virginia. And after we lost the election, I was, very upset, disappointed, and wanted to find something to do about it. And fortunately, a producer friend of mine connected me with a guy named Guy Seaman, who had this idea to do a documentary film about this decline of trust in society. A lot of the things we had both been thinking about were something that we were really aligned on. And so we set off on a journey together to go make that film.
Okay. And like you said, Guy Seaman, he's kind of like the on-screen personality who's kind of like leading the conversations and questions and interviews on this. So like you said, you guys were kind of connected because you're both kind of hover around politics and stuff like that.
Exactly. And Guy spent his life in politics. He had never made a film before. And so this for him was his first kind of venture into that. And so he had a lot of ideas about why these things were happening based on his research in, politics and working in politics. And then I had a lot of ideas based on my experiences working on the campaign, coupled with, real life experiences and such. But I think together, what we were really able to do was bring that blend of filmmaking experience with political operative knowledge and try to make something that was accessible for an audience.
And I don't want to like give, I guess, too much away about like the documentary. People should definitely go watch it. But what were, I guess, some of your biggest surprises or takeaways from filming this, and then like in just the general political landscape of our country as it is like now?
It's interesting because one of the things I didn't fully understand at the beginning, especially in Pennsylvania, which was one of the places we highlight prevalently in the film, is how angry people were. I knew people were upset and angry because of the election, but I didn't understand why. Why did they feel upset? And going into those places and filming there and seeing the decline of industry, the decline of communities, and those kind of things helped me really reconcile that understanding of this is why people feel the way they do, and they feel left behind. They feel as though they have been forgotten. And you can understand that, I think, when you go to those places. But until you go to those places, you don't really see it. And even growing up where I grew up, I had a sort of sense of that understanding because there's like things that happened in my childhood that I think about. For example, the local pharmacy closing and being replaced with a Walgreens. Things like that strip away local identity. And when your local identity is taken away, then there's also a bit of your own personal idea of yourself that's taken away. And in those places, when all of those industries and things that sustain the communities disappeared, so did that sense of worth and well-being. And so for me, that was a huge takeaway in filming this doc.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, there's that term that, people give them like flyover states. And then you also have like the terms that they give people from the coastal elites and all this. So like, that is definitely like, there's a clear separation somewhere along there. Like, so how did you kind of pick these three specific like locations to suit your documentary to like kind of talk to these people and like get a bigger picture of what was going on?
Yeah, we looked at demographic data, and this is something Guy really worked on early on before I started coming in formally to direct it. Hazleton was a place that had a large population shift. It went from predominantly Caucasian, Italian, Polish to Hispanic immigrants from the Dominican, places like that. Over about 10 years, that identity completely shifted from a minority majority to a majority minority. And so there was a huge shift in the population that had been there from the beginning. Erie was a town that had a large decline in manufacturing. A lot of those jobs went overseas, and so did those industries. Places that used to employ 25,000, 30,000 people now employ 1,000. And so those kind of things made, of course, a lot of resentment in the community towards those companies. And then Detroit, which also has had a lot of reinvention over time, but also is grappling with gentrification, reinvention, and what that means for the people that have lived there a long time. And to my mind, all three of those places represented things that could look like communities anywhere else in the country. Yeah. And so that was really the goal of this, to say that we're showing you these places that are feeling this more drastically, but it also could look just like the community you live in now.
Have you been to Erie, Pennsylvania before? Like, you shot any of this, or like
before filming? No, this was my first time. And so for all these places, I had not been to Hazleton or Erie. Growing up in the South and living in Los Angeles, I haven't spent much time in that part of the country. Obviously, that's changed after filming it. But no, it was an area that was very new to me.
Yeah, I've been to Erie like one time, way back when I was like maybe 5, 6, maybe like 10 years ago for like basketball. And I was there for like a short period of time. But like, there's definitely like you said, it's like almost an emptying of the cities and the towns. And it felt like very, very different than like where I was coming from, which was also LA.
Yeah. And that's the thing, that a lot of those places If you can understand why that happened, and then you can start contextualizing the anger those places feel, then you're able, I think, to feel a little bit of empathy for them and say, okay, this is why these people are frustrated and what can we do to make this better? Because obviously it's not just those three cities, right? There are lots of other places in America that look just like that. And so the question becomes, what does opportunity mean for all Americans, not just people that are coastal elites?
Yeah. And I guess the general, kind of discussion, like you said, you were kind of discussing the general polarization of politics and people and whatnot, but like it also felt like underlying kind of just general question is more like questioning of the American dream. Like what is it? Does it still apply to today? Is it still attainable? Like that kind of felt like that's something like is an overarching theme of this film as a whole.
Yeah, because the American dream is a concept, right? It's this idea that I think all Americans to a certain extent are raised on, that if you are born and raised in America, you can do anything you want, you can make it, you can own a house, you can have a happy life, retirement, etc. And when that becomes unavailable to you because the reality of that vision coupled with the reality of how things actually are, there's a bit of cognitive dissonance there. You start to have this friction to say, oh, okay, I can't buy a house. Oh, I may not be able to save for my retirement. Oh, Social Security might not exist. Then you start to have lots of feelings about the country itself, and you start to not trust the institutions. You don't trust government. You don't trust organizations. You don't trust banks. These are things that become problems. And when we don't have trust in society, in our leaders, in our leadership, in our institutions, then that trickles down to everything else.
Yeah, totally. And I guess amongst like kind of that questioning of like the American dream, like some of the conversations that you were having in the documentary is just like, it was kind of touched on as like the globalization and like, I guess, modern capitalism as a whole and the way it's kind of being employed. But one thing I didn't notice from like people that you were interviewing, like they never really talked about like our system of capitalism and like how that is a big source of what if things are going on. Whereas it's always pointing towards like another person. Is that something that you also know?
Yeah, well, when it came to issues of capitalism writ large, that really wasn't what I wanted to tackle in this film, because there are other films that have tackled that topic, much more elegantly, I think. That's one of the challenges of making a film like this, that, you might watch it, someone else might watch it and say, well, why didn't you talk about this? Why didn't you talk about that? We certainly considered all those different angles, but the thing that I thought about, the Social Dilemma did a really good job about talking about the role of social media in film. There have been numerous documentaries that have talked about capitalism and such. And so I thought that the thing that we really needed to focus on more was the issue of trust and the issue of communal trust and what that actually means, because that film I hadn't really seen. And so it was about saying, how can we explore that topic, because you can read about some of those other things too.
Yeah, totally. Totally.
But you're not wrong. Like, I'm not saying you're wrong at all. But that was why we kind of constrained that, because there's we shot enough material to shoot and put together a miniseries. But I opted not to do that, to kind of create a challenge for ourselves to compress it all down to 90 minutes, which I highly don't recommend in shooting something over 8 years. But I thought it was important to say that if you're going to make a film about trust and erosion of trust in communities and what we can do about it, was important for me to present it to you in 90 minutes so you could sit down with your neighbor you disagree with, your family member you disagree with, whatever, to have a discussion instead of asking you to watch 5 episodes to come to a conclusion.
I mean, it makes sense. Now that you mentioned, you said there are a lot of other films. There are definitely a lot of other films that have covered this topics and kind of adjacent topics about this overarching feeling in the country. But on a more personal level, I can definitely see you want to kind of go there, because once you do start kind of going to these other bigger ideas, it can turn into this, like I said, 30-hour documentary, because those are very deep, intense topics to talk about. And not just 30-hour documentary, but it lacks the focus, because there's so many topics you can talk about and that have contributed to these erosions. And I think we do touch on a lot of them in the film, but it's, as I kind of pointed out to our team and we were making it, the thing that you really have to do here is say, we've got all these experts and all these subjects. Some of these people have written books and books about this topic. How do you give people the Cliff's Notes version? So if they want to learn more about it, our film gives them that opportunity to do so. I guess when you're filming something like a documentary like this, which is obviously such like a social issue, social topic type of thing, and people bring their own opinions and perspectives to it. As a filmmaker, like how hard is it to kind of keep your own, I guess, opinions and perspectives from like kind of shaping the film and just letting it happen as it is?
Well, with this film in particular, there are plenty of people in it I don't personally agree with, to be frank. There are some people that I strongly agree with. There's some people I strongly disagree with, and that's experts and subjects. But I felt that my role as a director in this film was not to kind of tip my hand either way. It was trying to say, what is it that someone thinks about this topic? It doesn't matter if they're right, wrong, accurate, true, not true. It matters. This is how they feel, because the people that feel certain ways about things, that is their reality. And so my question would be, if this person feels this way about this topic, who is someone else that we can interview in this space that feels the exact opposite way? And how can you have this kind of push and pull between them throughout the film without me explicitly putting my thumb on the scale to say this person's right, this person's wrong? And so what we did was we found those experts across the spectrum, some of which are more left leaning, others more right leaning, and then would contextualize that. So then you as a viewer can kind of think about their thought process and hopefully come to some conclusions on your own.
Yeah, I think you did like a really good job of that, because I was like, that's why I kind of asked it, because you did kind of present this in a way that is like very fair and down the middle and allows people to kind of come to their own conclusions, which isn't always easy to do. Like a documentary like this can always go the Michael Moore route, where it's like very much like, this is what we're doing. You can shape it to make people look almost however you want to, stuff like that. But I think you guys did a really good job of like presenting it, kind of straight down the middle.
Thank you. And I have to say, like, that's the hardest thing I've done directorially for a film like this. I've never done a film quite in this vein before. Probably won't again either, for the record. It's a hard thing to do. But going into that with that intention to say, how can we really try to make something that doesn't feel like it's a propaganda piece, that doesn't feel like it's an agenda piece. That's really what we did try to do. And that is a very big challenge to do right now because of the way American society is. It's extremely polarized. There's that lack of trust. And so when I sit here saying, we're going to make a film that's for the left and the right and the center and everyone can watch it together, I think most people kind of laugh at you because they're like, no, there's no way. You have a bias, you have a thing. And so I'm really proud of the fact that, when people have actually sat down to watch it, I've had people come to me that are really conservative and people that are really liberal and both get things out of it. That's been really gratifying for sure.
Yeah, that's one thing I wrote down in my notes specifically, is like perception is reality. It's something I've always kind of talked about and like kind of thought of myself, is like, people always wonder like how people can think certain ways, but at the end of the day, like, it doesn't really matter because that's how they see things. And if that is their reality, and they're going to act and make choices based on their reality. So like, you have to kind of approach it from that perspective as like, this is their perception, this is their reality, and this is, you just kind of work from there. Is that something that you also kind of like had in your back of your mind?
Yeah, that was something that became more apparent as we were shooting, because I think it shouldn't be a secret to most people, but I think sometimes we don't think about this because of social media, especially Facebook, Twitter, things like that. You'll see someone post something about a certain topic that's divisive, and then someone will start commenting on it. Then an argument breaks out, and somebody starts trying to convince the other person why they're wrong. It doesn't work. It never works. It's a waste of everyone's time. And so the much better route, the thing that I learned on this film, one of our experts, Dr. Tanya Israel, talks about this, is to elaborate. And it takes a little bit more time. It takes a little bit more effort and curiosity. But that's saying, instead of saying, oh, you're wrong about this, it's saying, oh, that's interesting. How did you come to that belief? What were the events in your life? What were the moments? What were the things that made you decide this is your reality, right? And when you do that, you may not agree with how they got there. But then you start to contextualize, okay, this is why this person feels this way. And then you can start to have a much more productive conversation about any given topic. And I think it would do a lot of us some good to start reframing our conversations that way. Because if you want to change someone's mind, you have to start with trust. And if that person doesn't trust you because you just said they're an idiot that knows nothing, you're dumb, you're not going to get very far because they don't trust you. But if you can start having this moment where you can say, okay, now I understand you. I understand your perspective. This is what happened in my life to make me feel this way. Then you start having that back and forth conversation that might lead to someone changing their mind about something. But telling them they're stupid and telling them they're an idiot is not going to help you, I promise. And I can know that for a fact from Facebook arguments.
This is true. This is true. Like, I mean, like you said, you touched on it a little bit, then we'll go forward to it, but like the role of social media and media in general, like the internet is like, it's become so tribal in a way where it's like, it doesn't allow room for that type of deeper conversation and topics. But that's why I think like conversations like this are so important, because it does allow people to speak fully and like wholly instead of just in little short clips and bursts to get a point, like basically to score a point for their side. And whereas this is like, let me just hear what you have to say. Here's what I have to say. And then you can kind of go from there.
Well, I think Tanya also said in the film, I'm citing her a lot because we talked to her extensively about this topic, but she said something that stuck with me, which is that we reduce people to bumper stickers and slogans when they're on Facebook or Twitter or whatever platform, right? We hear someone say this phrase and then suddenly we associate them with all these other things. And people are more complex than that. People are not a bumper sticker or slogan. And I think that when we spend a lot of time engaging on the internet as opposed to in real life in, community groups or pickleball leagues or bowling leagues, things like that, whatever it is that we can find common interest in around things that aren't about politics, we can start to know people in different ways than we do on the internet. And that's one of the problems we have in our society, is that over the last 50, 75 years, there's been this massive decline in community engagement in real life and participation because we've chosen not to emphasize that anymore. And I would argue, and so would some of our experts, that is one reason why we are so polarized, because we just don't know each other anymore, because we're not engaging with each other in those ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something you can notice, something I've noticed just from my neighborhood in general. Like, you don't really see neighbors interacting necessarily as much as they used to when I was like maybe younger and kids out playing. Like, you don't really see like that no neighborly, I guess community. Everybody kind of just stays their own world. Everybody's worried about their individual and stuff like that. And like, you don't really get that room for communication. So in terms of polarization, do you think like this time period is... People always say this is the most polarized America has been. Do you believe that? Do you think that it's the most polarized we've ever been as a country?
Well, the film would also argue that this is not the most, it is a moment where it's been polarized. We can go back 100 years and see very similar things in very similar ways. But you know why we don't remember that? Because the people 100 years ago aren't alive anymore to tell you. And so you have to start diving into history to start exploring some of these things. It's funny because right now, a lot of the issues that people have around immigration, for example, this is not the first time it has happened. If we go back to history, we will see the same sorts of rhetoric around Polish Americans, Italian Americans, et cetera, in the 20s and that period as well. And so the things that we are talking about change over time because assimilations of different groups, but the same repetitions, the people's Italian American grandmothers that didn't speak a word of English, that was happening 100 years ago. The grandchildren of the people that were here 100 years ago don't speak a word of Italian. And so it is kind of interesting how we are just as in a polarized moment as we have been in historical cycles of American history, but we don't think about it that way because the groups that were once polarized are now assimilated. It's the same thing.
Yeah, that is one funny aspect of the documentary that I did notice, is that like there was some people you talked about that their parents were immigrants themselves, and then they're also pointing to immigration being a problem. And I'm just like, do you guys not see like kind of like the disconnect or something like that?
There is a cognitive dissonance there, isn't there? Yeah. It's very interesting that you picked up on that. But yeah, I agree. There is a definite bias there. And it's just because we forget our own history. And when we forget our own history, we sometimes don't have empathy for history that's happening in the present.
Yeah, it was definitely funny because it's just like, you guys were part of the out group, then you had years and decades to assimilate, and now you're part of the just wider American culture. But then now you're pointing to people that are out of the out group and be like, you're not. It's just like history repeating itself over and over again. And that's something that's unfortunately something that continues to be a theme.
Of course, and it will continue to be one. And that was one thing that, I really enjoyed exploring in this film, kind of understanding that better, because all of those topics I didn't know tons about before I did this film. That's one of the fun things about making any film. You kind of learn a lot about a specific thing, and then you move on, make another film, do the same sort of thing. But with this, learning a lot about that history of repetition in American history was really quite fascinating. I hope that when people watch it, it helps them to contextualize the present, which is one reason why we tried to do that deep dive about saying what's happening now is not just about what's happening now. It's about what happened 100 years ago.
Yeah. And I guess also with like in terms of like the media and stuff, and I guess in terms of being politics as much of an everyday kind of topic and point of interest for people nowadays, which wasn't always the case. Like even if you go back to our like my parents' generation, like they didn't talk about politics every day. It wasn't like in their face every single day, and like all these things that like you have to worry about from politically, socially, and stuff like that. But like, why do you think it is such a point of reference from part of your mind for people on an everyday basis as opposed to it is back then? And like, is there any way kind of back from that, you think?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. So first of all, one of the main problems, and we argue this in the film, is that there's kind of been a nationalization of everything, right? And that's somewhat because of the internet. I wouldn't say just even nationalization, maybe internationalization of everything, that we now understand and know about specific things happening in the world, in the United States, that we would have never heard about 30 years ago. And that's not to say that some of those things shouldn't be heard, because obviously there are voices and people that have been marginalized for many years that would not be able to express themselves in those ways then that can now. That is a good thing. But I think what becomes a problem is, and this is where we're experiencing a lot of this now, is that instead of us being able to actually understand what's happening in our communities, what's happening with our neighbors, building trust in those ways, we have now become so focused on what's happening nationally, what's happening internationally, what's happening in the things that we literally have no control over. We become very angry about those things. We become very engaged with those things. And you can't tell me a damn thing about what's happening with your local water commission when they're about to raise rates, right? Because you've been so focused on this thing that's happening up here instead of engaging with the things you actually can control, which are happening in your backyard. That's something that I think has contributed to a lot of this. And that obviously I think is a bit of a problem. And it also goes back to what I said earlier, it erodes trust, because now you don't understand or know your neighbor, you don't understand or know what's happening in a community. And then everything else that becomes way out of your control becomes frantic and panicked. And that causes you to be more anxious about everything. One thing that I would highly recommend, I think it's terrible to watch 24-hour news, turn off your TV, read things. One thing that I do to keep myself sane, and this is not speaking from the point of the view of the film, just my personal, is that I read news instead of watch news. And I read news at the end of the day when a story has finished breaking. One way to feel anxious about the world is to see a breaking news headline where you don't have all of the information. It used to be when you had a newspaper, you would get 2 or 3 editions of that paper, a morning edition, an afternoon edition, an evening edition, and the same thing would happen. A breaking news story in the morning would evolve, more information in the afternoon, final information in the evening. By reading something at the end of the day, when it is finished, you now have all the details, you have now all the context, and it makes it much more, helpful and informative to you as to what's going on in the world, as opposed to getting bits and pieces of information that may or may not be accurate. That for me has been a very helpful tool to kind of feel less anxious about everything.
Yeah, I totally agree. I tell people all the time, like, I don't watch the news. I'll read the news, but I will never go on a TV news channel and watch it, because they're like more opinion pieces than anything.
Repeating. It's often repeating itself too, because 24-hour news is watching the same news stories over and over and over again with little bits of new information as the day progresses, and lots of talking heads that are just opinions. Like the thing that changed in the late 80s was the fall of the fairness doctrine, which basically said that all news programs must offer parity for what is being told. So that means if you're doing 50% things that are more conservative, it must also be 50% things that are more liberal. And so news was much more centrist and balanced. So when you talk about people from another generation talking about, well, the news used to be fair and balanced in real life, well, that's because it was. It was forced to be by law. When that was repealed in the 80s, that's what caused the rise of cable news, of opinion shows, all of those things. And I would also point to a lot of that. I think that if you find a commentator on one of those platforms that you affiliate with, it's the same thing as following someone on X or Facebook or something like that. You're going to see the world through that entire prism. And I don't think that's very healthy either.
Yeah, it's definitely been a continuing kind of push to make everything basically internet based. And like they were trying to compete with obviously like the social platforms and stuff. So they all kind of went that more opinion based figurehead personality person instead of like giving just straight facts anymore. Like that's
more profitable. Yeah. Like, to be clear, there's a reason that happens, because it's much more engaging for you as a subscriber of that content to become more dedicated to it than, here's 30 minutes of the news and we're just going to spitball the facts of what happened today. That's not very exciting. And so I think that there's the entertainment element of news that has become very problematic. And that's something that is something you as a consumer have to choose not to participate in, but that's up to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's that age-old saying motto, if it bleeds, it leads, meaning like the more sensational it's getting pushed. Like you're not going to get everything else. You're just going to get the most sensational. That's all you're like feeding yourself 24/7. Then you're just going to think the whole world is just falling apart,
Mm-hmm.
So I guess
always.
I mean, when you take away from all this, what are some like your biggest takeaways? Like, what are some of your surprises? What do you think like any common ground was found during the whole process of this, like deeper understanding from people? Like, where do you kind of see things kind of heading from here after like filming this documentary?
One of the nice things about filming a project over time is that you do get to see those evolutions and trajectories. So, for example, in Hazleton, one of the places we filmed that had a lot of issues of immigration, they've found ways to integrate those communities better. For example, there's a Hazleton integration project that works with newcomers to the city to kind of learn how to speak English, how to enter the school system, after school activities, even scholarships to college. There's things like the Hazleton Arts Center that say we need to have things that give people opportunities to come together in other ways. So that's something that community has worked on. And that's not to say that all of their solutions have been, found and there's nirvana. There's not. But it's ways that community members recognize that there's a problem in our town and it's not sustainable if things keep going this way. And so that was one of the takeaways I had, is that you have to see the problem in your community first, to say, what is it that's going on in our community that's not working? What is it that we can tangibly do as citizens to band together to make it better? That was one thing. Another piece that came to mind was the way that we talk about things. So there were a couple of people that change their communication style. People that were conservative or liberal, when they were having conversations with people, they would initially have these conversations, well, all liberals are stupid, all conservatives are idiots, whatever. And they started changing their diction to, well, I don't like what the national Democrats are doing. I don't like what the national Republicans are doing, but we like our local representative who agrees with us on these things. That kind of change in dialogue makes someone feel like they're talking about those people and not talking about you as an individual. Because if you're telling someone that I'm a Democrat and I think you're stupid because you're a Democrat, then again, like we said earlier, your entire conversation has been shut down because they're talking about you. They're insulting you. And I think that having that open mind and being able to have a constructive conversation while also maintaining, what you stand for. I'm not saying you should, retreat from that. It's just about changing the way that you have dialogue with people, to make it more understanding based, less that I need to win an argument, and really try to say, okay, what is it I need to understand about this person so that we might have more constructive dialogue and perhaps be able to have a better mode of persuasion to get someone to my point of view, you know?
Yeah. I mean,
it's hard. It takes time. And that's why we don't like doing it, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, like, you had some very good takeaways at the end of this film. Like, you kind of listed them out for people, steps that they could take. And just like, I'm like, those are all very, very good. I also just think about some people I know and I'm like, are they going to follow? Yeah. Would they do all of this too? Like, that's kind of also.
And that's the thing. Yeah. Right. Because we do give you tangible takeaways at the end of the film that I believe are things you can actually do. That was one thing that was frustrating to me as a director of the last 8 years, because there have been films that are similar that have come out. I'm not going to name names or anything, but some of those films have given the answer of, well, just talk to people. Well, that's not enough. Talking to people is a little bit of a cop out, to my opinion. And so one thing that we do need to do is kind of say, what are these tangible action things that I can personally do? And the things that the film recommends, I think, are things that most people can actually do. But it does begin with you making that choice. I cannot make that choice for you. And so these are suggestions, obviously, not mandates. But I think that you understanding what you can do tangibly and saying, hey, maybe this isn't working, is a really good step. Because I think that most Americans can probably agree that the way things are right now isn't working very well. Yeah. And so if it's not working very well, that requires a change. But again, it's the adage that it begins with you. It's very, very true. One thing that I have found really amusing when people talk about national politics is they say, oh, well, Washington just doesn't work. Well, who comprises Washington? People that local communities send. And if Washington isn't working, it's because something's not working locally for you at home. And so it begins with you.
Yeah. I mean, I just remember, like, because you did follow-ups, you came back years later and re-interviewed people, and then there's just that one guy who, like, seemed to be still in the exact same place and being like, well, everybody else is stupid. Like, I don't know why we're not friends anymore. Well, I was like, well, I was just thinking, like, maybe that's probably why. That's a big part, because you think everybody else is stupid. It's just like,
it's true though, because like, while there were people in the film that changed, there were also people that didn't. And I think that's also true of real life, right? You know, and that's why we show that, to say that like some people are going to have a change in their point of view and some people are not, based on time and experience. And that's okay. Those are not people that are going to necessarily be engaged with how do we make our communities better. And that's important to acknowledge. Some people don't want to change. Some people do not want to engage. And it's really a question of, if there are people like that out there, how many of us are there that can actually, you know, make a difference? And you've got to be able to be one of those difference makers if it's something you want to be engaged with.
Do you think, like, kind of the current shape and place we are as a country is also, you kind of touched on it, like, also part of dealing with like our extreme individualism versus like a sense of common sense of community, where it's like, win at all costs, you be successful, you get there, no, step on whoever you got to be successful. But as long as you're winning, everything's like great. Like, is that something that you also think is like a big part of where we are?
There's been a huge piece of that throughout American history. It's this push and pull between the identity of the American individual, just like the American dream, right? It's just, that's also a concept. Mm-hmm. There's the individual versus the common good of the community. And when that balance is out of whack, then you start seeing things push towards one way or the other. And I would argue right now, the individual is a little bit more in the lead than the community is. And I think that we've got to see a little bit more of that push back towards the common good of the community and the common good of people. Because when we aren't serving that, then it becomes really messy. Because if everybody's individual needs are about myself, then we're forgetting about the other people that need community and need things from our community. And that goes back to what we've been talking about throughout our conversation.
Definitely. So I guess, like, kind of throughout this whole process, from when you first started filming to now, has your opinion or feeling about where we are and our state as a country changed for the worse or for the better, or stay the same, like, during that time period, especially obviously with the recent election and everything else going on?
I've had a few people ask me this question. Am I more optimistic or less optimistic than I was when I started 8 years ago? I think that this latest election shows that a lot of the issues we cover in our film are unresolved. That is what I think. If the election had gone a different way, then I would have been talking about this film in the sense, well, some of the things that we talked about in the film have clearly changed and evolved, and these is, how we arrived at this moment. But because of how the election went, I think it's very clear that a lot of places in America are feeling that resentment. They're feeling that left behindness, that feel like those issues have not changed for them. And expressions of how people feel like that are seen through elections. And so I personally would say that I'm more optimistic about the future than I was at the beginning, because I've seen these people and places change over time. I've been fortunate enough to see how people can evolve, how people can shift, and be able to throw aside some of the nationalized rhetoric about things and say, this is not necessarily how regular folks feel. This is not necessarily how very online folks feel. Regular folks are not quite as intense as most people that we read about on the internet, as much as we see on television news and such. Most people just want to live their lives and have harmony. And so I think for me, being able to see those people and places more personally has helped me to say, okay, this is something we can get through if we can, have more open discussion about it.
Yeah, I think the term that people use is like keyboard warriors for people who are like act completely different in person versus
keyboard
like online.
Warriors. I don't trust a keyboard warrior. Somebody that's got a really strong opinion about something on either the left or the right is not generally indicative of most people. And so I find that when we see those more extreme examples through online interactions, that becomes, again, the thing that makes us think, oh, well, all of these people feel this way about this thing. That's not usually true. And that's one thing that this film definitely helped me to compartmentalize.
So how's the overall response been to the documentary, that people have seen it, to people that you've shown it to, just the general public? How's the response been so far?
The response has been really great. We have 100% on Rotten Tomatoes at the moment, which is nuts. And we've really heard from people across the spectrum, even on my own personal level, people that I know growing up where I did that are much more conservative than I am, and people that are really liberal that are my neighbors here in Los Angeles, equally responding to the film. And that has been something we've been hearing across screenings in the United States. We've been hearing that in different online venues. It's been really gratifying to see that response. But as I've been saying, at the end of the day, it's great that people have that response, but to make the changes, that's a choice that the viewer hopefully has to make. So I'm curious to see if the people that watch the film kind of recontextualize how they think about these things and make a difference. And that's not to say that I think our film is suddenly going to, make a kumbaya moment with everyone in America, but I do hope that the people that watch it are able to say, what role do I play in this and what can I do to make it better? If we can do that, then I will feel like we were very successful.
And I guess how was what was the feeling? How'd you feel when it was like all done after 8 years? Film finished, film completed, edited, completed. You got it down from 8 years to, like you said, 90-minute runtime, which is crazy. I don't know how you did that, but like, what was that feeling?
I don't know how I did either, honestly, but it was a relief for sure. I'm very proud of the work we did. I'm very pleased that we pulled it off. I think that sometimes when you're making a film like that, it's very hard, and it was, to see the end of the tunnel throughout that production process, to say, are we filming this endlessly? Are we shooting in the dark? Where is this going to go? What is this story going to do? How's it going to play out? And so for me, being able to complete that challenge was a real gratifying moment in my career, to say we can do things like this. I also have no desire to do anything like it ever again. I don't want to do never again. This was a one-time deal for me. I've told my agents, my producers, everyone I work with, that this is a one-time deal for me. But I'm really proud that we did it, because I think that if we had tried to do something more contained, something that was shortened, you wouldn't get that trajectory of time and perspective. And I think that is extremely valuable. And so I'm really proud of everyone that worked on the film, Guy and our editors and our animation team, our DP, everyone that worked on it, to really bring that to life and stay focused over that period of time. I think it's really remarkable work from all of them.
Yeah, if you'd have finished this in 2018, which was originally, it would have been a very, very different film.
Very different film because you would have missed all these other things. And, that's something that is the problem with a current events film, right? Is that current events are always
Constantly
happening
changing.
every day. And so you have to be able to come to a point where you understand, okay, this is it. And for me, I knew we were going to make this an 8-year film. So regardless, this was going to come out in 2024. But when the Trump assassination attempt happened in July and Biden dropped out, I said, that's it. This is the cutoff, because it didn't matter what happened after. But what did matter was those two events were unprecedented new things that we hadn't seen in the modern era. They'd happened in American history. There have been assassination attempts, and there have indeed been candidates drop out. This is not new, but it hasn't happened in a very long time. And so I said, these unprecedented events are our cutoff. And that was why we chopped it the way we did.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense because if you'd have kept going, that would have changed things even to a whole nother degree.
It didn't even matter. And that was the thing that I realized from a creative standpoint. And mind you, I didn't have a choice because my distributor had a cutoff date where I had to deliver everything. So, it's not like I could keep going indefinitely, but it was something that I knew just creatively. I said that this makes sense, that this is where this would stop. Because if you're able to do that, then everything that comes after is a reaction to all the things that come before, because that's we've been filming over 8 years. And so it doesn't date the film. It doesn't make the film less relevant. I think that you could probably watch it in a couple of years and it might still feel just as relevant, actually. But it's about saying, how did we get to this point, to contextualize that so that you can understand what to do in the present.
Did you get to show, or did any of the people you interviewed get a chance to watch it and stuff like that? What was their response to that?
Oh, yeah. I've been very gratified that the response to people that have been in it's been pretty positive. I've gotten a lot of experts that have loved it. People that were in the film itself loved it. And so that is a great relief. It's always a challenge when you make a documentary and the people that participate in, well, we're not sure if you pulled that, out of context. That can be hard, but it's nice to hear that they felt represented well. And that is the job that you have as a documentary director.
Okay, so where can people watch The American Question if they want to?
Yeah, it's available on demand on multiple platforms. You can watch it on Apple, Amazon, YouTube, Google Play, Fandango at home, Vimeo, DVD and Blu-ray if you so prefer. So if you just type in The American Question on Google, pick your platform of choice, and it will be available to you.
All right, and we'll have the links down below everywhere this goes up, and everyone's watching and listening. But also, what's the future? What's next? Like you said, you're not going to do a part 2 of this. So what's next for you? Like something a little lighter to change things.
I've absolutely shot down. I was like, I've had a couple of people ask, do you want to do a sequel for another 8 years? I said, absolutely not. If our distributor or financiers decide they would like to do that, I will happily executive produce it, but I will not direct it. So that will not be the next thing I will do. There's a new project I'm working on that I can't talk about quite yet, that I'm very excited about. That is an extremely different genre. And so you should hear about that in the coming months. But it's nice to be able to move on to something that is very different and also is going to be an entirely new challenge for me as a director. So stay tuned.
Okay, cool. I mean, hopefully we get a chance to talk to you about that as well. Love the documentary. It was very in-depth, very insightful, and I think did a good job of presenting what you were trying to present and giving a picture of kind of the current state of the country and the people in it and kind of their thoughts and opinions about where things are headed. So I definitely think it's a must watch for people that are interested in documentaries, just interested in kind of our country and our culture as a whole right now.
Well, thank you, Dario. I appreciate that.